Neurodivergent Moms, the podcast. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to a new episode of Neurodivergent Moms, the podcast. Today, I'm with Kirsten Lindsmith. Hi, Kirsten.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here with us.
Yeah, of course.
Today's topic, it's a bit delicate. I'm gonna tell the audience my way towards you. I was reading a book from a Spanish author called Ernesto Reaño, and he mentioned your article there. So I'm very curious. I love researching. So I went into your blog, your website, kirstenlindsmith.com, and I found this article called The Dark Side of the Stim Self-Injury and Destructive Habits. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I need to interview her. So yeah. Kirsten, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I have an autism diagnosis. I'm 33 years old currently. I got diagnosed at 19. So I'm like technically a late in life diagnosis, but it wasn't that late. But it's like, I went through childhood without a diagnosis. And when I got diagnosed, I, got really into autism world. I kind of developed autism as a special interest. And I've done on and off since then a lot of various like consulting work and public speaking, things like this. And like I've been a home therapist and a classroom teacher for an autism school, a couple of them, stuff like that. Home care, like various just things in the autism world. And it's like, it's something I love talking about. uh,
Great. Well, if you think you're late diagnosed, I'm almost 38 and I only found out I was autistic months ago. So that is very late.
yeah, I feel like the typical late in life story is usually people who are like over 30, and just the only reason I still use the term late in life is that compared to the people who, like, I feel like there's almost two camps. Is there's the people who are diagnosed early and spent their kind of formative childhood and adolescent years like knowing they were autistic and having that like immersed in it, and they're treated a certain way because of it, versus the people who kind of got through childhood and afterward. Though I do think it's like a definitely totally different experience for me who got diagnosed young versus someone who I've met people in their 50s and 60s who got diagnosed like truly later in life. So everyone has it affects kind of your self-image in terms of how you think of yourself as an autistic person and what that means.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's never too late to get to the point where you really, really get to your identification, your true identity, right? Because for me, like I found out I was neurodivergent through my children. So first it was my giftedness and ADHD diagnosis, but then I was like, there's something missing here. And now I can truly say that I feel that my identity is complete, you know? So yeah, never too late.
That's a really common one that I hear of, that a lot of the people who it's like they get to their 30s and beyond for diagnosis, it will often be because their children get a diagnosis. And so then they learn about autism, they see it like, oh, well, we have these traits in common, like something's up. And there are people who like, when you grow up autistic, you live your life autistic, that like something is different.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily everything. Like I truly didn't know that other people didn't have my sensory experience, stuff like that. But like it's one of the paths where people will see themselves in it.
Yeah.
And I I feel like there's two camps of, there's the people who their children get diagnosed, so they learn about it and they're like, hey, this is me. And then there's the other camp of, I love Stephen Shore calls them aphids, autistic parents heavily in denial, where their kids have an autism diagnosis and they insist that they don't. And
Yeah.
like that it's their kids and they like just are literally undiagnosed autistic, just plowing through life stubbornly. But yeah, I think
I know a few of those parents. But I look at them and I'm like, oh man, you need to get there. It's your path, you know.
yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
And how was like when you found out that you were autistic? How was that? How was that process?
Yeah. So, I mean, I actually had a similar trajectory to you in that I got diagnosed with ADHD first
Mm-hmm.
because when I was in elementary school, the school basically said that they were going to kick me out if I wasn't medicated. So we had to get me assessed, just get the ADHD label so that I could get a prescription for medication to stay in school. Um, but like it wasn't until I was in college, I was dating a guy
Mm-hmm.
um, who he had an autism diagnosis, and you know, his family were like mostly autistic people, and I just like I learned about autism. You know, I
Mm-hmm.
looked up the criteria and stuff, and was like, oh, I fit all of this. I started researching. I read like every back post on Wrong Planet for, years, and eventually was like, yeah, this would explain everything. Like, I'm not broken. I'm just autistic. And so then began the long, like about a year-long process of trying to figure out how to get a diagnosis of like, I got the referral from my primary care doctor for the insurance. And then I kept booking at places that said they could do autism assessment. And then either I would show up and they were like, actually, we don't do that. Or they only worked with children that back then, this is now a while ago, like the autism world was like very almost exclusively child focused, and getting a new diagnosis as an adult was harder. Uh, I remember one person I booked an appointment with who then sprung it on me that they actually didn't do autism assessments, but they could go over the criteria with me. I was like, whatever, I have the appointment, I'll stay. That she told me I can't have autism because I have a boyfriend. And I thought that was so weird because my boyfriend had autism. So like, does it go in the inverse? Like, um, and eventually, like after trying so many places, I found like the neuropsych department of a local hospital did assessment. So I got the full, like, the 6 hour thing where you're there all day with a lunch break test. And my the head guy, I think, was ahead of the curve. My diagnosis that he put like in an email in his notes was autism slash Asperger's slash NVLD. And back
Mm-hmm.
then, and Asperger's were two different diagnoses, and NVLD was separate in the DSM. And I personally thought of them as all the same thing. So I was like, oh, wow, like he thinks like me. And then, like, maybe I forget when the DSM-5 came out. It was like a year or two later, the DSM-5 came out, and autism and Asperger's were united under the autism umbrella. But
Yeah.
yeah, that for me was like, it was, for one thing, like I think not everybody needs to pursue a official clinical diagnosis, especially if it's like, it can be expensive. If you don't have insurance, it's like prohibitively expensive. And if you don't have a good reason to, like, you don't need accommodations at work or school or, certain medications or therapies or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
not be worth it. I think that self-diagnosis can be like valid in the sense of just your identity and knowing how to accommodate yourself in your life and
Mm-hmm.
communicate with people and like work on yourself and whatever. But for me, the official diagnosis felt really important for like, I'm I'm the type of autistic person where I have a lot of like very meaningful disabilities, but I come off as, for people who aren't autistic especially, like a very normal, that
Mm-hmm.
I'm the kind of person where neurotypical people especially will do the like, oh, I never would have known if you hadn't said anything. Like, I knew that I would have a hard time. Well, for one, I wanted accommodations in college, but so
Mm-hmm.
that like in the long term, I knew that to really get taken seriously, I needed a diagnosis. And that, especially for women, but this affects everyone, uh, people tend to just the long psychiatric history of treating women as crazy and hysteric and stuff, that like women, autistic women tend to get misdiagnosed with things like bipolar and borderline
True.
personality disorder and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. And I think that a lot of autism symptoms, when especially a woman is exhibiting them, but honestly anybody, a lot of autism symptoms will be dismissed as like just being unreasonable, or again personality disorders, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And that having that like official stamp of approval matters a lot for like, besides just like, work and school relationships,
Mm-hmm.
ships, romantic relationships, communicating with other people, and like communicating with doctors and therapists, getting the right types of treatment. Like, I don't know, I think it's in a lot of cases it can be worth it for that alone to not be written off or misunderstood. So for me it was a big like my whole childhood and adolescence had
Mm-hmm.
been where like, everyone hated me and I didn't know why. uh People would give me like inspirational pep talks about things that I couldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
uh only if only I tried harder I could XYZ, and I knew I was trying as hard as I could. uh
Mm-hmm.
like once an ex-boyfriend told me like, oh, what was it, we were trying to have a conversation about feelings, and especially back then I had no diagnosis, no self-awareness, never, just wasn't capable of talking
Yeah.
about feelings, knowing what I was feeling or talking about it. And something of like, he shared how he was feeling and he wanted me to share how I was feeling. And I like, there was nothing. Like I described it at the time as like blue screen of death, like the computer has locked up and there's nothing. And he was like saying things like, oh, just open your mouth and talk. Just first, don't overthink it. Just the first thing that comes out. And I was like, no, I don't, you need to take it seriously. And he said something along the lines of, you're not a robot, you're a human being. And I'm there just like, well, I can't do this. I know I can't do this. So does that mean I'm not human? Like, just
Mm-hmm.
interactions like that, moments like that were my whole life. And so the autism diagnosis was the big like, okay, I'm not broken. I am human. I'm just autistic. And there are other people like me. Like
Mm-hmm.
I can talk to people who have this exact experience and I can understand myself better.
Mm-hmm. It's
Yeah,
it's
it
like
was,
we need that validation. And what really triggers me is that we need to go to a stranger, right? To a person that we've never met before, for that person to tell us who we are. So people will believe us, right? So it doesn't make much sense. Like the system definitely needs to change. But I get you. I get everything you're saying. Because yeah, especially sensory wise, I always got the, oh no, you're overreacting. Oh, that smell is not that much. Oh, and yes, oh, you're a woman. You're hysterical. Yeah, that's like the typical answer.
it's like how people tend to downplay women's pain and discomfort in general. Like in
Yeah.
medical contexts, women won't get painkillers, men will get them right away and stuff. But like add on sensory issues where other people just aren't experiencing it. And they're like, why are you such a baby? You're overreacting. Like this isn't a problem. And you're like, but it is for me.
Mhm. Yeah, totally. So yeah, we encourage people to get the identification, to go through that process if they can, because well, I don't know there, but I'm in Ireland, and here the waiting lists are huge, and the prices are enormous as well. But yeah, hopefully that will get better as well. So now that I mentioned the sensory part, I'm very curious about how was your school experience from the sensory point of view?
Well, like it's funny because as a kid, I didn't think about my sensory problems as much. I can tell that they were there because it's just stuff like I was a very picky eater. I was really sensitive to sudden loud sounds. I remember in one of my earliest memories is in preschool. I refused to flush the toilet because it was too loud. I didn't know that at the time. I just didn't like doing it. And that one of the teachers who the preschool I went to was like a free for employees, like university one where all the teachers were like grad students and undergrads. So this was like a college student who she was the one teacher who like kind of recognized what was going on a little bit. And she taught me to flush the toilet with my foot and plug my ears and do this, like, make it sound like the ocean. And
Oh,
that
wow.
like it would be safe. She called it pretending to be a bird. So like a bird, you use your foot and then making the ocean sound to make the noise of it less scary. And I still do that every time I flush a toilet. I do this to make the noise bearable.
I'm gonna
But
tell that to my daughter. She has the same thing with the every time she flushes the toilet for her. It's too loud, so sometimes she doesn't flush. And that's a very good tip.
yeah, just literally
Thank you.
because just plugging, I can still hear it, and it's like kind of annoying. And so I do
Like
the
this, yeah.
back and forth. This it makes it, sound like the ocean, whatever. Just little things like that. Um, that like I remember in like in high school, as I got old enough to be like walking around without an adult, it was just like me and other kids walking around, that whenever a ambulance or police, anything with a siren would drive by, I would like jump and yell and cover my ears, and no one else reacted. And it was just like, oh, I'm just silly and sensitive. And like that certain lighting, especially like walking outside when it was bright. Like
Mm-hmm.
I needed sunglasses or I was like I couldn't see, and everybody
Yeah.
else was like, it's not like it's fine. And like my eyes aren't like that light of a color. Like I'm not like just the doctor couldn't figure out a reason for me to be so light sensitive. Also the typical thing of where as a kid I had my hearing tested over and over for being like deaf. My hearing was better than average, but like, my mom would call my name and I wouldn't turn. I'd be like focused on something.
Yeah.
And um like just wouldn't be able to pick out what she was saying. Also, I even bigger than and now have, whatever audio processing disorder where like my brain doesn't separate out um speech from regular other sounds
Mm-hmm.
properly. They all just blend together. So like I always watch TV and movies with captions. And if someone is talking to me, especially if there are other noises going on, like I'm in a crowded space or whatever, I really like to be able to see their mouth so I can kind of read their lips while I'm
Yeah.
listening. And stuff like that. That was another reason they thought I must be hard of hearing, because I could never tell what people were saying. I was always saying what, and like, you had to repeat it a few times before I could get it. You had to speak to me really loudly and clearly. But uh, things like that, that I uh, I remember even after my diagnosis, it took me like a long time to discover other various sensory issues. Like I never knew that overhead light was a problem for me
Mm-hmm.
until I was maybe 20. It was, I don't remember when this was, 20 or 21. It was in college after my diagnosis, and I had just been to an autism conference where Stephen Shore gave the keynote, and he walked out on stage wearing a hat with a brim,
Mm-hmm.
and he opened up with saying like, here I am in the autism uniform, uh and said like, this type of light, these are the worst ones, the round recessed light, they're like it's like they're just pointing directly at you. Terrible. And whatever, that was, experience at the conference. I came home, I was back in school, and I went to the first day of a new class in the beginning of a semester. And I walked into the room. This was an older lecture hall, all dark wood inside. It was like dim, like it was not bright inside. I walked into the room and I started feeling like kind of sick almost. I found a seat and sat down, and I was feeling like I had a slight headache. I was a little nauseous, and just like, and I was thinking to myself like, oh, I hope I'm not getting sick. Like, I feel bad. And I remember I looked up. I was just like thinking about what Stephen Shore said, and I looked up, and this dim room had the circular recessed lights, and there was one above me. So I did this, and I stopped feeling sick immediately. It's like, oh my God, I'm one of those people. Like, I have. So
those little, well, we call it little, but very important details, they're so good to know. Like for me now, and it's funny. I was talking to somebody else today, and I found that many people who get the diagnosis, then after that, they're more conscious of their sensory needs, right? So, for example, my sister the other day is like, oh, right now, like I realize I cannot live without loops, right? So, for me, like I remember the other, no, it was like a month ago. I went to pick up my daughter to these, indoor playground full of kids, and the lights, and it's like too much. I wasn't wearing my loops. I walked in, and the moment I walked in, I felt I was going to be sick. Like I got nauseous and everything. I was like, and the me like 2 years ago me will have stayed and just put up with it. But no, I was like, no, I'm not doing this. I'm coming back. I'm going to the car, just put on my loops, and then so now I feel like I'm more, gentle with my nerve, with my nervous system needs, right? And I think that it's so important because my life quality has improved so much. And yeah, it's self-love, self-care, and yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to just, I'm very conscious about time. I wanted to dive a little bit into your article. Could you tell the audience a little bit about what is it about?
yeah, so I had originally written a different article about stimming and just sensory self-stimulation in autism and how it's healthy and good and necessary and all that. And then I wanted to write a counterpart, which was this second article we're talking about, which is the ways in which stimming can sometimes be unhealthy, and that not all stimming is healthy. Stimming as a concept is healthy and necessary, but that this article about, the dark side of the stim is about basically destructive or damaging stimming that are things that basically cause self-injury, and presumably things that you want to discourage, not engage in, or engage in as minimally as possible, or find like a safer alternative so that whatever the need that's filling can be met in a better, safer way. But it's something that I feel like is really important to talk about, because one of like pretty much the most common type of email reach out I get from people who read my articles, see videos I'm in, whatever, is about either themselves or a loved one engaging in dangerous stimming or habit behavior, and they're asking for help to deal with it. So I wrote this kind of as an overview of both, like, this is a really important topic, it's really, really common, and then also like, here are some general overview tips for all these people.
Yeah, and we're gonna go through the tips in a bit, but while I was reading it, I came up with your one of your ideas that you were talking about pain as a universal distractor, and I found that very interesting. Could you explain a little bit that?
Yeah, my college degree, which I don't use, it was basically just my special interest at the time. Uh, Mostly it's what is it? It's a combo degree of biology, microbiology, and physical anthropology. And I remember in one of my classes was basically an anatomy and physiology class that was a really deep overview of different vertebrate systems. And when we were learning about sensory organs, one of the things I found most interesting is that all of the different types of sensory receptors in the body will eventually stop firing if they're stimulated too much. Like the types of sensory cells that fire in your nose when you're smelling something, if they're stimulated in the same way a
Mm-hmm.
lot, they'll stop
Mm-hmm.
firing, which is why, and I say this in the article, if we have scent blindness, that if you're smelling a smell all the time, say you smoke cigarettes and you stop smelling it, say you live with a cat and you stop smelling the litter box, but then you go run errands and you come home and you're like, I need to clean the litter box, that you'll literally stop experiencing a sensation
Mm-hmm.
if it's happening a lot. But pain receptors, like free nerve endings, never stop firing no matter how much they're stimulated. That which when it comes to pain is useful. Like, you don't want to forget you have an injury, you want to be able to take care of it and baby it properly.
Mm-hmm.
Pain usually indicates a problem, so we do not become immune, desensitized to pain. There are certain brain mechanisms where if you're at a low grade of pain all the time, you can stop, like, you don't think of it as a big deal, but you're always feeling it. You won't stop feeling it.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally think that's the reason that dangerous stimming is so common, because it's so useful. Like, if you are overwhelmed
Mm-hmm.
with other types of stimulation, whether they're literal or emotional, you can feel something stronger if you can feel pain. So it's like, it makes sense as a go-to of, like, if you're suffering and you need to drown it out, you slam your head against the wall. Like,
Yeah.
it works. Everything
Mm-hmm.
else is and it's something that anyone has. Neurotypicals have this. Again, it's just how pain receptors work. So the thing of, you slap someone in the face to snap out of it, stuff like
Yeah.
that. This is a physiological truth. And it does become dangerous, especially for autistic people or for anyone in general who is overwhelmed so often that they need to escalate to an extreme to drown it out. That pain is the natural go-to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That is so interesting. It makes so much sense, but it is something that, you wouldn't think about it. And, when I was reading it, I was like, oh my gosh, like this makes so much sense and it explains so much. Um, so I'm curious, and it's fine if you don't want to talk about it, but have you experienced this kind of thing yourself?
Yeah, of course. I would say both categories. I kind of break this into two overarching categories of that. There's, like, I called it in the article, overload and bad habits. The overload I consider like almost like a PRN medication, like it's an emergency, break glass in case of, in the moment. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
bad habits are things that aren't necessarily even trying to distract. Sometimes they are, whatever, but they're usually not in an emergency, a more slow, controlled, gradual type of harmful stimming. That the overload, like, when I am in, like, true meltdown of, like, 10 out of 10, not maybe like 9 out of 10 or more, the kind of overload where you're basically like, you're not quite human anymore, like you're not yourself, and you don't function. That the things that work best for me to deal with that are hitting my head really hard against things, slapping myself, like clawing at my arms, like anything like that. Like, it works. It makes me calm down. At the very least, it makes me suffer less. And it's something that, especially like hitting the head, that's
Hmm.
dangerous. Like I don't, I don't want
Yeah.
to do it. That it's something that the more you do that, for people who that's their go-to, that can end up like you can cause concussions and stuff if you do that. That's never happened to me. I've never had a concussion, thank God. But like that has happened to plenty of autistic people who do this. And then in terms of like bad habit ones, I for most of my life bit my nails really badly, like the nail and the skin around the nail, like all the way down. It's like bleeding and stuff. And I have a little write-up about how I stopped that. I eventually stopped it in college. It was hard. It took like maybe a couple years before I like fully stopped. And I'd say I still haven't fully stopped. Like I'll sometimes bite at the skin around my nails, or in some circumstances bite at
Yeah.
my nails, but I don't do it all the time. Like my nails are pretty long right now. Like I consider myself not like a nail biter. I also constantly bite and pick at my lower lip,
Hmm.
which is much harder to break than nails because I can always feel it. I can get into it later. The trick to break these types of habits, especially for nails, I think is easier, and the reason that the mouth one is harder. But like I also tend to do the thing of, when you have a scab or something, picking
Yeah.
at it. I'm
Yeah.
much better at that than I used to be, but like that's another really common one. I wrote a whole article about like dermatillomania, trichotillomania, because that's one of the most common things I get reach outs about. So there's a whole separate article just on like skin picking.
Yeah. The skin picking, it's very, I'm quite familiar with that. And what you were saying about the nails, the skin around your nails start doing this, and I realize I'm very stressed and maybe it's about to go into burnout or whatever when I'm, doing this a lot. But yeah, that, and you don't stop thinking about it, and you're like, it's a normal thing, everybody does it, But then if you consciously think about that you're harming yourself, right? Yeah, it can, yeah,
Yeah,
it's
like
quite
I would
serious.
sometimes get like kind of low grade infections in
Yeah.
the skin around my nails. Like it would always be hurting. I would sometimes bleed from going down so far. And that's stuff that I think they're mostly gone, but still to this day, some of my nails, the nail bed is too far back. Like it
Hmm.
does that I've lost some of the attachment point. Like a lot of it grew back. The like where the white moon at the end of the nail is,
Yeah.
a lot of that did reattach further, but it's still further back than it was before I bit my nails and that it should be. And I think I've like hit a limit of restoring it. It's been a long time now, so
Um, so regarding that, you were saying about, some kind of tips and recommendations for, to stop doing that, or, for the nails. Do you have any tips that you would like to share?
yeah, I would say for one, again, I break it into two separate categories. I think the tips for both are different. Of that, there's like how do you deal with the emergency overload behaviors is different from dealing with the habit behaviors. That for emergency overload, it largely comes down to, for one, like the first easiest one, especially to prevent it before it happens, or like if it's in the initial ramp up, is
Mm-hmm.
removing the problem. Sometimes you can't do that, but if it's something easy that's like, for example, the example I use in the article is that my mom, when she was a teenager, so this would have been like probably the late 60s, she was a babysitter for two little girls, one of whom was autistic. And the autistic girl, if she heard applause on the TV or saw her sister's belly button, would have a intense off the rails meltdown, hurting herself, like
Yeah.
whatever. So this, I think, is a perfect example of just remove the problem. Is like she, changed and bathed the girls separately. so she didn't have to see the belly button. And when they were watching TV, she would turn off the TV or mute the TV whenever it panned to the audience or at the end of the show, because those are the times when there would be applause.
Yeah.
And just like that was one that they could just control the stimulus. Then also, I think watching for indicators that it's coming. Like if there are smaller, like say the thing you're trying to avoid is the head banging or like hitting yourself in the head or whatever. Like if that's the escalation point you want to not reach,
Yeah.
track the things that happen before that point. Of another example I put in the article is I once worked with a little boy who he would punch himself in the head, but he would start pulling his hair first. And it was always the same ramp up that I never saw him go straight to punching himself in the head. He would try other things. So if he was grabbing his hair, I knew like, okay, warning sign, like he needs, and then this is the second idea of redirecting or like basically kind of just some other substitution that for, this boy that I worked with, if he's usually the problem stimulus would be something like we were in a school. I was one of his classroom teachers, that the problem we say another kid in the class is screaming. He can't handle the screaming. So remove the problem, could be bringing the kid who can't handle it out of the room or bringing the screamer out of the room. It depends, but usually bringing this one kid out of the room into the quiet space where he can just have a break away from his loud classroom. Then he could go back. It's like, if you're kept at a 70 all day, you'll escalate to that 100 more quickly. But if you can have a break so you can ramp back down to like a 40, then maybe the screaming will agitate you, but it won't bring you all the way up immediately. And if you can't bring them out of the situation, some other type of stimulation that serves a similar enough purpose, usually things like this that I find that are safe, are things like pressure, especially on the joints, releases a lot of good regulatory chemicals. So, squeezing the wrists, squeezing fingers, shoulders, working down the arms. A trick I learned from an occupational therapist I worked with once is that she would, on kids, pinch down their finger and then squeeze pushing down on the fingernail is a good, like, you don't need much pressure to give a good kind of regulating pressure.
I do that to my children. What I do is I press into 3 different places in the finger and then the nail, and then I also pull a little bit,
Yes. Yeah. I saw that work miracles on children. Like me and her would sometimes work with the same kid. Like I would be, the teacher or the therapist, some other type, and she would be there for occupational therapy. And that like she could stop a kid who's, ramping up to a meltdown by like doing basically a hand massage of like, she called it like, one of them was greeting the hands of like squeezing down the bones in the hand, ending with the finger, a little gentle pull at the end. And it like, God, it was a crowd pleaser. It just, everyone loved it.
Yeah, basically attending to it's all about the proprioceptive system. Yeah. Those have the work very good. Yeah.
Another thing that I found works really well for a lot of different types of people is vibration. Like if you get like a body massager, they make really gentle small ones that are often used for occupational therapy. They usually look like it's like a little hand-sized thing with 4 legs, like a little creature, and that around the jaw and chin stimulates the vagus nerve and is like very calming. Then also for more intense input, a stronger like vibration massager on like more like sturdy parts of the body, like back massage, arms on the legs, something. It depends on the sensory profile of the person. Like I personally, a massager on my legs tickles. I would hate that, but I've found that to work really well for a lot of people is just like it's the deep, intense input. It's almost like pain, but it doesn't quite hurt. And it also
Mm-hmm.
is, though, of course, being careful of things like, the stomach. And I actually know someone who bruised the tip of their sternum doing this. So,
Oh, went
careful with
too far.
the and then also like strong vestibular input. Again, this depends on sensory profile, but like
Yeah.
spinning around, being upside down, those, a swing, things like that are just like that can be really strong and distracting. Even someone who normally doesn't like it can be a good replacement for pain because it's so intense.
Yeah.
I also list loud music here, but that's one to be careful with, especially if you're doing it to yourself, because like you can damage your hearing if you're playing really loud music directly in your ears. But I've had a lot of success with other people, with kids that I've worked with, of playing a song, say on my phone, that's like very kind of sensory stimulation-y and moving it from ear to ear, like
Uh-huh.
draws a lot of focus and gives a lot of input while being safe. And it doesn't have to be that loud, like, not
Yeah.
hear damage level loud. Um, like one of the in the article I talk about this, I usually try to think of like 4 replacements is you want something that is similar-ish to the problem behavior they're doing, of like the person who is banging their head, punching themselves, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Probably deep pressure would help, of just like squeezing them really tight, squeezing down their joints, even the head, of like squeezing their head, squeezing the fingers, deep pressure. If they're screaming a lot, like just, looking for indications of the meltdown.
Yeah.
Screaming isn't self-injurious, but like if they're screaming, they might be someone who likes the auditory input. Usually the playing a song and moving it from ear to ear was most effective on the kids who would scream through their meltdown. So I take that as like that's an auditory input kind of thing. And the kids who I don't tend to do this, so I can't speak for adults, but of kids that I've worked with, the people who trash the room, start throwing things,
Mm-hmm.
maybe throw themselves on the floor and flop around, tend to benefit from vestibular input. That's if they're throwing themselves on the ground, pick them up and spin them around. Or, be like, okay, that's it. We're going to the swing set. Like,
Yeah.
no more throwing things. Just like finding kind of a sister input to the
Yeah.
biggest main character of the meltdown. Um, for this is one where also I think it's easier to give advice for autistic people
Mm-hmm.
for these, that alternatives to pain, you can get a little more specific, especially if you prepare. That the classic, like old school one is holding ice cubes.
Mm-hmm.
Like in theory, ice can damage the skin, but ice cubes are small enough that even if you hold them until they melt, you won't burn yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, like things like weighted blankets, weighted clothing, those stretchy things that you wrap around you to then push against, those can be a nice way of getting pressure without needing another person. Or if you have another person, have them sit on you or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, I personally maintain a playlist of like intense, stimulating music that I can play myself in headphones. That's like focusing, drown things out. So I would say making a playlist of songs that work for you in that respect. And if you're a caregiver, making your own playlist of songs that you've tried that your charge responds to well. The squeezing the hand stuff is something you can do to yourself too.
Yeah.
That's do to
Definitely.
myself. And then also some other classic things, like things neurotypicals do, the cold shower, or like a really hot shower if cold is just unforgivable for you. And again, not too cold or too hot, and try not to stay in it longer than like 10 or 20 minutes, but like a sensory shock
Mm.
of cold or hot. I've also heard of just if it's winter, go walk outside for a moment
Oh,
and
yeah.
like take off your coat and like kind of stand in the cold.
Mm.
Those types of strong input.
That one really works for me. And the very hot shower. Yeah.
I like
Um,
a hot shower than a cold shower person for
yeah.
this.
These are really great tips. Amazing. And they're very easy to accomplish. Like you don't need, you know, complicated equipment or expensive equipment just to do those. So
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
amazing. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's like some of
Uh,
the equipment could be like a swing that it's like if you or your kid or whoever really benefits from that, it's probably worth it to buy a
yeah, it
swing.
is worth it. Yeah, definitely.
Depending, you might not need to buy anything. Uh, there are some things where like for the habits, it can be often replacing a habit with a toy, especially for something that's like, especially for a kid,
Mm-hmm.
that's easiest. That I once worked with a boy who he would like claw at his hands when
Mm-hmm.
he it's like he acted like his hands were always itchy, which because he'd done it so much, it makes sense because they were always covered in wounds and scabs, so they probably were itchy by that point.
Yeah.
It's like he would create wounds in the palms of his hands. And I also noticed that when he was less overwhelmed, he really liked rubbing textures, like a really rough carpet and stuff. So the my go-to for like, they'd try gloves and stuff, he would just take them off. That my go-to for him was to give him, we had this toy at the school where he was that I don't have anything like that. I have a bunch of things like this, but I don't have one like that. That was like a cylinder with spikes all over it. And
Uh-huh.
it was not pleasant for almost anyone. And it was a little bit painful to hold, like kind of like thorns. And I would give him that to rub instead. And that he
Oh,
could,
yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
that if he was really overwhelmed, like that's where the low grade stress, he would use that. He would happily obey. If he got really angry, he would throw it away and like make eye contact while doing this because he knew that we didn't
Yeah.
like it. That's where also you watch for the ramp up. And if it's like, if he's that upset about something, then it's like, well, whatever he's upset about is the problem. And like, if you can just be like, all right, let's back down to the level where you can use the toy instead. That type of thing.
So, yeah, before when you were talking about, really paying attention to the the previous um the previous theming wise that you do before the hard ones, right? Is it like do you notice that it's like a pattern that you always do, like, steps, or how can you notice that that is happening? And then another question is, like, I'm very curious about this because obviously self-harming is very related to self-esteem and self-concept and all that. So to what point do we know it's about sensory overload or meltdown or all that, or we realize that it's actually, that we need to dig deeper because it's related to your emotional health and well-being? I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I would say actually a lot of these I think are emotional rather than sensory. Like,
Uh-huh.
for example, I never slap myself or hit my head against things. Like, I never do things like that for sensory overload.
Uh-huh.
Sensory overload, well, especially as an adult, sensory overload, I'm very good at like, I plug my ears, shut my eyes. I will like go to the bathroom, huddle in a cubicle, and just like cut everything off for a few minutes. Like I can I can ramp down from overload. I find that these types of things are more common in people who, for whatever reason, they are trapped in the overwhelming situation. They can't
Yes.
just like up and leave, either because they don't have the ability to, like, as soon as something is a problem, like the amount of awareness, process, and control it takes to be like, that's a problem, stand up and leave. Like they're like frozen in it, or they're a kid, they can't walk away from their classroom, they can't leave their car seat, whatever it is. But otherwise, that type of behavior often will be emotional. Like the thing you're trapped in will be a feeling like a abstract figurative feeling rather than a literal sensory feeling.
Mm-hmm.
uh, those are things where I think it still follows that there's ramp up behaviors to watch for, or like symptoms almost,
Mm-hmm.
where, like, for example, when I bang my head against things, I almost always will start slapping myself first. And it's
Okay.
like, if that doesn't work, I will be like compelled to go for something more. So, like, that's the point where, that's what you'd be watching for. Uh, I, and also, like, some people will have like a ramp up where maybe they're yelling. And if they're yelling, that means they're going to escalate to a self-injurious behavior. That if they were regulated, they wouldn't be yelling, they would be talking or whatever,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
looking for those types of behaviors. Even the like habit type self-injurious behavior will have ramp ups and warning signs. And I think that there's the habits also can be broken into like intentional self-injurious and accidental self-injurious. Like, I would say
Uh-huh.
the nail biting I did was not intentionally self-injurious. It was
Yeah.
more of a compulsion of, I would feel a rough edge, I would have to deal with it.
You're right.
Whereas
Yeah.
self-injurious is like, when I was younger, I would cut myself on purpose, the way a lot of young people do. And it
I will do
just,
the same when I was younger. Yeah.
but there's like a whole laundry list of reasons that behavior is appealing, and there's a whole list of things that are alternatives to that I think I even have in the article. But I only have a few in there. But that, like, that's something where there are usually ramp up things to look for. They'll often be more subtle, but it'll sometimes be something like, say, crying first, yelling. Also, you can look for like triggers. Like, is there some type of category of thing that happens first, and
Mm-hmm.
is control? Like, for example, if every time you fight with your boyfriend, you're cutting yourself, can you break up with the boyfriend? Not for a teenager, but like, that especially for anyone who's a caregiver, that's the angle I would look for, is both tracking triggers. I mean, that applies to all of this, tracking triggers, the things that seem to initiate the sequence, and then also tracking ramp up behaviors.
Yeah.
Like, do they try something else first? Like, especially when I would cut myself, I would usually be scratching myself first. Like, that would be my go-to. That's attached to me, like, whatever. And when that wasn't good enough, I would escalate. So you can have like various warning signs, you can have your list of coping skills, and be like, if one of these happens, I need to turn to this instead. But yeah, same rules apply about removing the problem stimulus, and then identifying triggers and redirect methods. But
Mm-hmm.
it can be
And
harder to
and
remove problem stimulus, though.
and it's also related to how do you see yourself, your identity, if you accept who you are. Like for me, I remember, like I don't remember much of my childhood and my teenage years. There was a lot of smoking weed just to, stop my brain. I remember, for me, it was like I just cannot stand the noise in my head. You know what I mean? It was like my thoughts couldn't stop. My I'm not good enough. I was completely aware I was different and I couldn't cope the way others. So I was like, oh my gosh, there's something wrong with me. I'm broken, blah blah blah. And all these was like, it got much better once I realized what was happening and came to terms into who I am and what I need for me, right? And I think that right now, almost 38 years, like it took me very long. Um, Now I can say I can fully accept myself, right? And I'm open to, like, I'm openly myself, right? But and like I can't remember last time I cut myself. Like it's been many years. But I think it's also very important when we were talking about getting the diagnosis and knowing about your needs and, taking care of you and tending your nervous system. It is very important and it will help with this a lot because it, like right now I can say that I don't get to that point where I'm like on the verge, of going into like dangerous stimming, right? Whereas before I wasn't even aware of what was going on with my sensory needs and all that. And that is also like intimately related to your emotional regulation, right?
Yeah, that's another thing of, I think, advice for caregivers too, is that I feel like because lack of self-awareness is basically baked into autism, that one of the best self-advocacy skills of like raising an autistic person who will become a future adult
Yeah.
is teaching them whatever level they're capable of self-awareness and which builds, you can't have self-advocacy without self-awareness. You need to know what you need. And that in my experience, all autistics can learn some level of self-awareness. Like even if they are non-speaking, very high needs, that you can have some level of like, hey, when like I see you're doing that, when this happens, we should be doing this instead
Mm-hmm.
because we wanted to get to this. I know that you don't like getting to this. You don't like getting in trouble for it at the bare minimum. And like and then I can be the help to help watch you and point out when this is happening. And here's your, here's your alternative, get in your swing, stuff like that. And that the kids who people act like can't learn, well, like they want to take care of themselves, they want to feel better. This type of behavior is them taking care of themselves, is them
Yeah.
trying to feel better. So if you give them tools that work better and show them the tools and practice them with them, eventually they will start doing those things on their own. Like if you have a kid who is, trashing the room, causing problems, having a miserable time, and every time you bring them to the swing and you're like, hey, I see that it feels bad right now, let's go to the swing, and it works, they feel better, and you do that every day for a while and they remember, they will start going to the swing when they feel bad. Not
Yeah.
every time, like maybe if they ramp up and they're just, you'll kind of like too much meltdown, you'll lose that level of self-awareness of like,
Yeah.
or you won't be able to act on it. But like I have seen kids who, again, the kids that people treat like they can't learn, they're just mindless, whatever. Like these kids will take care of themselves if they are shown a proven replacement
How to
habit.
do it is
Um,
it yeah, I like it. I'm glad that you brought that out because especially with non-speaker autistic people, autistic children in this case, people think or assume that because they don't speak, they cannot think, And oh my gosh, like no, no, they're not speaking, but there's nothing. It's not related to their IQ, and yeah, it is very important. And I think like what I've done with my students and even with my children, I think there are two things that are key in raising children and teaching them. It's body awareness and emotional intelligence. And our body will always give us signals. And if we learn how to listen to our body, right? And then, we give them tools, it's going to be much better. Like their mental health is going to be much better than our generation, for example. And sometimes it's not, the ideal one. Like, for example, my living room looks kind of a OT room because it's full of peanut balls and, and lots of fidgeting tools and all that. And that's the way we live and that's who we are, and it's grand, and we are happy that way. But the fact that a child can get to a point where it can say, oh, I'm doing this means that I need the other thing, right? Like that is amazing, and I think we should all aim for that.
Yeah, 100%. And my advice for teaching bodily self-awareness, because I think that there's a scale of, you need bodily self-awareness before you can have emotional self-awareness, and you need both of those types of self-awareness before you can have self-advocacy and taking care of yourself. That I think the lowest level of teaching bodily self-awareness, because of course autistic people generally have a lack of self-awareness, a lack of physical awareness of their body, won't remember to check in, all those types of things, is instilling a habit of regularly asking. Like, it's okay if you don't notice when you feel hot, nauseous, headache, whatever. But if you can get in the habit of, like, say if you're in the classroom or you're at home or whatever, like every hour or some interval, like maybe you have a little alarm on a watch on them or something, or alarm that's like, it goes off and you say, oh, okay, how are we feeling? Like, how does your head feel? How does your face feel? How does your chest feel? How's your breath? How's your tummy feel? And like walk them through a basic one, be like, okay, we're good. And then do another check-in. And like the thing that really helped me build this was not paying attention to my body all the time, whatever. Like, I can't run that in the background unconsciously, but it's remembering to check in of like, I don't do it at regular intervals. I don't have an alarm anymore, but at least once or twice throughout the day, I will find myself wondering of like, how do I feel right now? Do I have anything weird going on? And doing a little check-in and being like, oh yeah, I think I'm physically anxious. I'm gonna like breathe slower for a little bit. Okay, I feel better. Getting in the habit of doing a check-in means that you can adapt to the fact that you won't notice naturally.
And definitely.
And then once you have the body, you can pay attention to the emotions, because you can look for what the body's signals are of the emotions, build it from there. But
it's like, for me, it's like sometimes if I'm in hyper focus, I don't notice that I'm hungry or I need to go to the toilet or whatever. So for me, sometimes I get a headache and I'm like, ooh, wait a minute. Have I eaten? Like, where's my water bottle? Like, what's going on? And then I've noticed that it's been like 3 hours I've been doing whatever. And with the kids, what I used to, like, I'm not teaching anymore, but I used to use this, and even with my children, I kind of play that, the hand is a scan. So you scan your whole body. So how is my head feeling? How is my chest? How is my tummy? And, we go like little by little. So there are many, many ideas, as long as we make it playful for them, right? But it's like you were saying, the aim is for them to be able in the future to be aware that they won't notice that, but they can do, as you were saying, a couple of checkups, around the day. And yeah, very important. Well, Kirsten, this has been awesome, and I feel I could talk to you for another hour, but I'm sure you have a life. So yeah, thank you so much for this. And I just wanted to ask you, like, if someone wants to reach out or read your articles, where they can find you.
Oh yeah, so my website is kirstenlindsmith.com, and on my website I have links to both my email, and also there's a little contact form, but like were ways where I basically encourage people to email me if they have questions or need things. I will warn that I don't check my email very often, so it might take me time to reply, but I usually try to reply to all of the things that I do get that are like, direct questions and kind of thing. But yeah, I think that it's stuff that, also looking through the stuff I've written on my website, because a lot of the more common questions I get are things that I've written about.
Yeah. Great. And this is kind of a tradition now in my podcast. I have a last question. What advice would you give to another person that you wish someone had given you before your journey in the neurodivergent world?
I think this depends, because for my specific circumstance that I wish someone had given me is probably like too specific to me and would be about something along the lines of like that, to not get too deep into trying to think that I can fix all my problems by researching and pathologizing myself, that a lot of my problems don't have anything to do with autism, and that trying to be too perfectionist with that rabbit hole of like, oh, if I identify this symptom, I'll be fixed, is like, that's not how life works. But I think the piece of advice I would give more generally to especially like that I think applies to pretty much all autistic people, and also probably caregivers, is that like life will be an inherent pattern of ups and downs, and the downs will always come back, but the ups will also always come back.
Mm-hmm.
That nothing lasts forever, even the bad stuff. And when you hate yourself, wish you could, you'd hit a button to be neurotypical, like you're the problem, everything's horrible, whatever, like that won't last forever. Eventually it'll end and you'll feel better again. And that I think one of the best ways to focus on that is I love the article, and I think she's turned it into a book now, The Obsessive Joy of Autism, by what's her name? Julia Bascom. That it's still, the article is still free online on her blog from like 2011, but that she writes about like as a, that she's a disabled autistic person, and that the reason she considers autism worth having, of like that she appreciates being herself versus the neurotypical alternative, is that special interests and perseveration are a type of joy that people who don't have this can't experience. That like engaging in a special interest, engaging in perseveration, when it's good, is a feeling that neurotypicals chase and covet, and they don't have access to it as easily. I remember I once read a self-help book called Flow that I found fascinating, because it was about chasing this flow state of like perfect focus and the world falls away, and it's like, and like that state is so accessible to me. Like I can fall into that really easily, too easily sometimes, and that some neurotypical people haven't ever experienced it and want to, or it's like fleeting and rare, and that's perseveration, and it's just part of autism. So this level of joy that is available to autistic people is like, that Julia Bascom says, that makes all of the hard parts worth it. It's like an enlightenment level of joy.
I agree 100%. The autistic joy.
Yeah. But again, I think my core advice would be that nothing lasts forever. The bad times will always come back, but they will always end. You'll always be going up and down.
Yeah. Awesome advice, especially for those who are going into the downs at the moment. So yeah, we'll always come up. Well, thank you so much for this. Thank you for being so honest, and all the nice tips and pieces of advice. I'm sure they're going to be helpful for lots of people. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Bye.
Bye.
Neurodivergent Moms, the podcast.